Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the session Military Space Operations Considerations on China and Russia. My name is Dr. Sim Kaur, and I am a faculty member in the Space Studies Department of the American Public University System, and I am the moderator of this session. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat box. We will address them during the question and answer session at the end of the presentation. Today we have two speakers, Dr. Kimra Fischel and Dr. James Rooney. Dr. Kimra Fischel is a political scientist specializing in U.S. national security, conflict, and strategic intelligence. She holds a doctorate in strategic intelligence and has taught at various institutions. She teaches at the American Military University and designed a Homeland Security course for the University of Oklahoma. Dr. James Rooney served 28 years in the Air Force in key leadership roles and a command pilot with over 3,500 flight hours. He is now Boeing's senior manager for the guidance, navigation, and control subsystem aboard the International Space Station. He has published widely, and his dissertation on the Xi Jinping's strategic motivations holds importance for the space and intelligence sectors. Now, I invite Dr. Kimra Fischel to give her presentation, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. And I think the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and share my slides. Put it in a slideshow for you. Okay. So I am looking at the use of the space domain in current warfare. And I'm going to do just a little brief overview of the space domain and the global security environment and the implications for defense and security. And this is just some introduction really to some current research that I'm doing. And if we look at the global security environment right now, as we know, it's quite perilous. We have two major ongoing conflicts involving direct warfare. There is a conventional land war in Europe following the Russian attack on Ukraine now about 2.5 years ago. And we have another major conflict in the Middle East involving direct warfare between Israel and Hamas since the October 7th, 2023 attack on Israel by Hamas. And both of these conflicts present prospects for a wider spread. And the countries and entities involved in these conflicts have linkages to other states and other organizations that pose significant threats to international security. For example, the Hamas linkage to Iran and Hezbollah, and the Iran linkages to Russia and the Russian and Chinese alliance, as well as the Israeli linkages to the United States, indicate the coalitions that are building around these belligerent actors. So for a world with major ongoing conflict, it's important to look at the space domain because space is now recognized as the fifth domain of military operations, the other domains being land, air, sea, cyber, and electromagnetic. So a question arises. Are the tactics and strategies used by belligerents in the space domain for these ongoing conflicts similar to those of prior conflicts? Or has a new dimension in space warfare opened up as revealed by these current conflicts? And what are the security and defense implications? So just to give a bit of history, a brief history, space has the potential to become a warfighting domain. And this goes back to at least the Sputnik launch by the Soviet Union in 1957 during the Cold War. And since that time, space has played a supporting role for military forces on Earth through satellites, through space-based intelligence and reconnaissance. It's played a role in strategic stability. And modern space capabilities are product of the Cold War technology. The first actual space war is considered to be the 1991 Persian Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm. And during this war, the United States used global positioning systems and space-based technology against Iraq. Well, the Iraqis did not have that same space-based capabilities, so this was very much one-sided. And if we fast forward to 2022, with the Russia-Ukraine war, David T. Burbach of the U.S. Naval War College states that this war, the Russia-Ukraine war, is the first two-sided space war. And with regard to the war in the Middle East, Israel's Arrow 3 is designated, or excuse me, is designed to intercept ballistic missiles outside of the Earth's atmosphere, and has now done so during hostilities. So if we go back to Operation Desert Storm, this is as reported by the U.S. Department of Defense News back in 2021 at the 30-year anniversary of the war. Lieutenant General B. Chance Saltzman, Deputy Chief of Space Operations, stated some of the ways that space was used during this conflict. And this was back in 1991. First, GPS-enabled commanders to track Iraqi army maneuvers through a sandstorm. This was the first time that capability was possible. 2, GPS satellites were used to determine enemy locations and enabled the use of precision munitions. Saltzman stated that there was both a physically and mentally devastating effect because Iraqis had no idea how the United States was able to track them through weather and to track also through nighttime conditions. And many of these capabilities that were initially deployed for Operation Desert Storm are now vital components of U.S. military operations. And one of the key differences today, Saltzman states, is that the space domain is no longer benign. And adversaries, realizing they cannot take on the United States military in direct combat, use space to gain an asymmetric advantage. What I find especially significant about this is that it's near-peer adversaries, Russia and China, that are really using this asymmetric means to challenge the United States. And for Russia, it has really been reinforced with its war on Ukraine. Russia has not had the success in Ukraine that it wanted. And David Burbach offers 4 lessons that I think are especially important with regard to space to highlight in this war. And first is that Ukraine has made effective use of space-based assets commercially provided by the United States and Europe. And Ukraine did not have to have these space-based assets itself. It could get them elsewhere through both governments and through private companies. Second, the Russian counter space attacks targeted the cyber domain. So you're seeing the overlap of space and cyber. 3, commercial assets are increasingly important in space conflicts. And 4, Russia has not gained advantage with its supposedly superior space capabilities. And due to its warfare in Ukraine, Russia is increasingly interested in nuclear space weapons. And that was according to DIA Director Lieutenant General Jeffrey A. Cruz. And an example of Russian interest in the development of nuclear space weapons is its development of the nuclear anti-satellite weapons. And these types of weapons threaten the modern way of life. And they're particularly troubling because Russia can afford to target space. It is not as economically independent upon satellites as other countries are, and including the United States. And this brings about what I kind of think of as a paradox of asymmetry. And the question arises, well, why would, near peer adversaries, near peer contenders for power do this? Why would they use space as an asymmetric means? And the answer that is often given is that, well, the United States has such superior conventional forces that they can't really take on the United States directly in conventional warfare or in a conventional means. I would suggest that one of the main reasons is actually not that, but to avoid nuclear escalation. The great powers do not want nuclear escalation, so they don't want a direct conventional conflict that could easily escalate to the use of nuclear weapons. So they're using asymmetric means as a way of avoiding that type of direct conflict. However, and this is the paradox, the use of space as an asymmetric means in warfare, combined with conventional war failures, may have actually heightened a nuclear risk. So if we look at the Russian use of space, there's failure in conventional warfare in Ukraine. They're using space asymmetrically. The result of that is that they have heightened interest in the development of space weapons, which is a further destabilization of the security environment and actually leads to an enhanced nuclear threat, which is the paradox in the use of space as an asymmetric means in the first place. It's a little bit different take on it. And in the case of Israel, Israel's a little bit different, but it's important because Israel's Arrow missile defense system, it was developed jointly by Israel Aerospace Industries and Boeing. And the Arrow 3 is particularly significant to space warfare because it can intercept ballistic missiles with nuclear and non-nuclear warheads outside of the Earth's atmosphere. And in the fall of 2023, the Arrow 3 intercepted a surface-to-surface missile outside of the Earth's atmosphere. And this is considered to be the first space combat. And this successful intercept during hostilities indicates the importance of advanced space capabilities and defense systems. And this use of space it actually was in response to irregular warfare. And according to Robert Redding, this highlights the complexity in warfare with the Houthi involvement in Yemen and by extension, Yemen and Iran in the Israeli-Hamas war. So for Israel, Israel was attacked about a year ago, and then we have Iranian-backed Houthi attacks from Yemen. In defense, Israel makes use of its Arrow 3 outside of Earth's atmosphere in direct hostilities, and this is space weaponry. And the significance of all of this is that space has now crossed the threshold and is considered a combat zone. So what are the security implications of the use of space in the current environment? Well, first of all, there is an enhanced nuclear threat environment. Second, with the Arrow 3, the threshold has been crossed for space as a combat zone. Third, this environment the threat is tied to offensive conventional actions by state actors, such as the Russia invasion of Ukraine. It is tied to offensive attacks by non-state actors, terrorist entities, Hamas attack on Israel. And the implications are the need for stronger deterrence to offset an initial conventional attack by states and prevention of terror attacks, such as what occurred on October 7th. And final slide is showing just some of the reference material in this initial research. And I thank you very much. And that's all I have for now. I'll turn it over to Jim.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kimball Fischel, for your insightful and wonderful presentation. It was very informative. Dr. Hala Kadim Taher has some comment on the chat box that I will read. He says the role of space domain awareness in space operations by understanding the capabilities and intentions of other parties in space, operators can minimize the risk of collisions, interference, and other potential threats. SDA is crucial for ensuring the safety, security, and sustainability of space operations. Recently, space platforms provide satellite communications, positioning, navigation, and timing (PNT) systems, Earth observations and intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance (ISR) applications, all of which ensures essential operational capabilities for armed forces. Even services that enable modern equipment, weapon systems, and the planning of operations represent an element of extreme vulnerability whose temporary or permanent unavailability can lead to transversal repercussions across the entire spectrum of military actions. Do you have any word on it? No? Okay. You are muted. Dr. Fischel, you are muted. Please unmute yourself. Yes.
Sorry about that. All domains work in conjunction with each other. So there is overlap among all domains, and what happens in one domain affects what happens in another domain. And I think, as it was pointed out by another military operations specialist, that it's not just in war or conflict, it's dominating an enemy or an adversary. It is not just dominating in a specific domain. So all domains do work in conjunction. So
thank you so much. And we have another attendee, and he is supporting you. And James as well. Thank you so much. And now I invite Dr. James Roney to give his presentation. Please.
Okay, let me see about sharing this. All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. James Rooney, and I have the pleasure of spending some time with you today to consider an important issue that could ultimately affect every one of us in the near future. And that is the weaponization of space and the rise of China as a global power. I've spent the last several weeks investigating and studying the problem closely. Today's presentation is titled Changing the Calculus of Military Space Operations, China's Pursuit of Counter Space Capabilities in Support of an Unrestricted Warfare Strategy. This study and this paper basically encapsulates what I've discovered in my research over the last couple of weeks. The presentation should take about 20 minutes. There might be a little bit of overlap between mine and Dr. Fischel's. That was unintended, but I think it'll be good to emphasize some of the key points. So the study considered 8 basic areas which were used to bound the problem and provide important insight into the underlying issues and the motivations. Since the early 70s, US foreign policy towards China has vacillated between engagement and containment. There were strategic pros and cons on both sides of this argument. What we do know is that access to space since the late 50s continues to evolve and now involves the participation of nations, of dozens of state-sponsored launch vehicles and satellites, as well as private business ventures. What I did notice during this study here is that China's emerging strategic culture, which at one time was considered immutable, appears to be changing under the rule of Xi Jinping, and that could have significant consequences globally. For that reason, it's important, as part of this study, to evaluate China in this period of what I call strategic uncertainty, as the country gravitates away from its traditional norms and values and towards a new military social compact that plays a critical role in China's space program. It also involves looking at space warfare doctrine from the perspective of how irregular or unrestricted warfare principles will be used to conduct weaponized operations in space. This, of course, leads naturally to considering China's total investiture in counter space activities, technologies, and systems, and also leads to how the US would have to respond to what can only be considered a direct threat to the space status quo. And lastly, we'll be looking at the study will consider U.S. space policy towards the operational doctrine of space control and domain dominance. The problem here is that China is fully invested in counter space. We've seen the evidence of this over the last 10, 15 years. And the question is China moving away from its classic status quo position towards revisionism? The hypothesis that I put out there right now is that China's pursuit of counter space weapons demonstrates that China's evolution to revisionist status while supporting an unrestricted warfare strategy to achieve its national objectives. So we look at the issue about engagement versus containment. For 52 years, the United States has struggled to adequately and consistently define its foreign policy with respect to China. Should the U.S. engage with China to assist in its growth and acceptance of more liberal political, economic, and societal values and extending the hand of freedom? Or should the United States seek to contain and restrict China's growth, seeing a rising China as a non-friendly competitor and a potential future threat? From 1972, when Nixon first approached China, till around 2015, the U.S. primarily chose engagement, even supporting China's acceptance into the World Trade Organization, which in no small part played a major role in China's exponential economic growth. During the same time period, China was viewed as a benign, developing status quo power, but things began to change in 2012 when Xi Jinping became China's fifth paramount leader. Recently, China's foreign policy actions and behaviors seem to indicate a political shift away from the status quo and more towards revisionism. One element of that shifting policy is China's support for counter space strategies that are aligned with more aggressive, unrestricted warfare doctrinal premises. China is particularly responsible for the continued evolution of space as a proliferating and more dangerous environment. From the beginning of man's venture into space, the domain has been militarized. As Dr. Fischel pointed out, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik on October 4th, 1957. It was the first of its kind in terms of a satellite that was designed to transmit radio signals back to Earth. The US was caught at the time by strategic surprise and reacted negatively to the news. The ability to place its satellite in orbit implied that technology could be used to launch intercontinental ballistic missiles, which posed a direct threat to US national security. Though most of the satellites launched in the 50s through the 90s carried military payloads, space essentially remained an operational sanctuary for most of that time. There were three principal competitors at the time: the Soviet Union, China, and the US, and they tacitly agreed that the risks associated with continuous and ubiquitous overflight coverage were offset by the benefits of keeping tabs on competitors that were similarly armed with nuclear weapons. But things began to change as launch systems and weapon systems technologies continued to evolve and improve. And in 2007, China ground launched an anti-satellite weapon against one of its own defunct satellites. Since that time, the Soviet Union, China, and the US have engaged in further development and testing of counter space technologies, weapons, and systems. So for all intents and purposes, space has gone from being militarized to being weaponized. Over the last decade, space has become more contested and competitive. Counter space strategies are now proliferating not only among the three main competitors, but among bad actors, proxies like Iran and North Korea. Essentially, there are four primary categories of counter space weapons: kinetic physical, non-kinetic physical, electronic, and cyber. Examples of each can be seen on the chart. Kinetic physical weapons include attacking ground stations from the air, land, and sea, and ultimately by future space-based weapons meant to destroy the station from space. Direct ascent missile-launched anti-satellite weapons, or ASATs, can be used against orbiting satellites and are meant to literally blow them up. Co-orbiting ASATs are the latest addition to the arsenal of kinetic space weapons that rendezvous and conduct proximity operations around a target satellite until given the command to either grapple or destroy the target. Non-kinetic physical weapons include the use of nuclear weapons that Kim talked about, and they're designed to blow up satellites, but they bring a real host of other problems, including a large amount of space debris and electromagnetic pulse that can negatively impact a large swath of other friendly and hostile satellites. Not very good for the space environment. On the other hand, high-powered lasers can be used to destroy or simply to render blind satellite sensors in either a recoverable or non-recoverable mode. High-powered microwaves do essentially the same thing. Electronic space weapons are designed to interfere with uplinks and downlinks by jamming or spoofing, which entails a radio transmitter near a target used to interfere with or mimic the target's satellite signals. Cyber weapons are designed to intercept or corrupt satellite transmitted data, or go as far as actually seizing control of the target satellite. All right, so China's emerging strategic culture. If you don't know what strategic culture is, it's basically the common ideas from a culture about strategy and how to conduct war. As you can see, I've got a chart here that basically looks at strategic culture according to 5 component parts, moving from a status quo or a low, what I would call a low use of force, through the reformer stage, the balancer stage, the parabellum realpolitik stage, and finally the revisionist stage. Strategic culture is a fairly recent addition to the 3 primary forms of international relations theories, which included realism, liberalism, and constructivism. Strategic culture defies and expresses ideas concerning how a common people or culture thinks not about how to just fight wars, but also about military strategy. And there are cultural and leadership components of strategic culture that are not usually considered in the classic IR theory. Strategic culture is normally fairly consistent over time within a given population, requiring a substantive, culturally affecting emotional event to affect change, like what occurred in Germany and Japan following World War II. But it can also occur when strong leadership that radically forces the population to change its mode of thinking about how a society should engage when facing external threats, and those threats are usually defined by that leader. Strategic culture is usually framed, well, I've already explained that, as observed on the chart. With the exception of Mao Zedong, who was basically a revolutionist fighting in an existential civil war for China, the next 3 paramount leaders, Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao, were essentially status quo leaders. Then in 2012, Xi Jinping came on the scene when he was elected president, and things began to change. You can see the period down there, 2012, 2024. There were several things that he brought to bear. His Belt and Road Initiative, for one thing. There are good and bad things about that. There's a lot of things in the paper about the Belt and Road Initiative. His building islands in the South China Sea, his naval dust-ups with the Philippines, Vietnam, and Australia, as well as his overtures to take back Taiwan as part of the mainland China's total sovereignty. So when you look at the status quo and the reformer parts of strategic culture, it harkens back to the days of Confucius and Sun Tzu. The unrestricted warfare, though, that's something brand new, and I'll be getting into that in a second. What we see, though, is that the current rise in Chinese nationalism among all classes seems to bear out support for more aggressive foreign policies, and this makes the case for a slow but discernible shift in Chinese strategic culture. In 2013, Xi Jinping publicly declared his China dream for a great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. Xi laid out plans for China's future. It's ambitious and ambiguous, and Xi's plan created more strategic uncertainty concerning not only where China is heading, but how it intends to get there. His goal is to complete the plan by 2049. Referenced throughout his vision are his disdain for current global power relationships, economic institutions, and the values, norms, and rules that codify current international relations and seem to act against the best interests of China. Xi's primary animus seems directed at the United States, and for the first time since the fall of the Soviet Union, IR specialists, intelligence agencies, and Washington elites are referencing a new China-US Cold War. Though his thoughts speak to the common good, Xi's declarations act to create disruption, confusion, and uncertainty. China is now using gray zone tactics that support strategies which pay homage to the dictates of a strategic culture based on the philosophies of Confucius and Sun Tzu that are now supplanted by a doctrine of unrestricted warfare. Gray zone tactics support coercive actions that are just shy of armed conflict, but beyond normal diplomatic, economic, and other martial-like activities, and are widely recognized as playing an increasingly important role in China's efforts to advance its domestic, economic, and foreign policy and security objectives, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. Gray zone tactics are embedded in strategic indicators that employ dual-use systems, actions, and behaviors that support the unrestricted warfare strategies. The United States military doctrine distinguishes 2 types of warfare: traditional warfare and irregular warfare. Traditional warfare is characterized as a violent struggle for domination between nation states or coalitions and alliances of nation states. In DoD Directive 3000.07, irregular warfare, or IW, is characterized as a violent struggle among state and non-state actors for legitimacy and influence over relevant populations. These actors may use non-traditional methods such as guerrilla warfare, terrorism, sabotage, subversion, criminal activities, and insurgency in their efforts to control the target population. The use of IW is all about gaining an asymmetric advantage over one's competitor or enemy. But in 1999, two PLA colonels, Tao Liang and Wang Zhengsu, intended to take Sun Tzu to the next level and wrote a book entitled Unrestricted Warfare, which literally means war without boundaries. This is literally a whole of government and society approach to the prosecution of war. What Liang and Zhengsu perceived from the American experience in two Gulf conflicts was that this war, which changed the world, ultimately changed war itself. What these authors are referring to are not changes in the instruments of war, the technologies of war, the modes of war, or even the forms of war. What they're alluding to is the very function of warfare in a civilized society. In a sense, every Chinese citizen is now a warrior, bringing their unique talents and skills to efforts supporting Xi's China dream. And the chart shows a comparison between irregular and unrestricted warfare. In their pursuit of space dominance, China is now using unrestricted warfare strategies and tactics in support of counter-space activities. This chart shows China's current investment in counter-space weapons, systems, and technologies. Along with Russia and the US, China has designed, developed, tested, and in several cases deployed and activated counter-space weapons systems across all three operational modes of ground to space, space to space, and space to ground. China has deployed dual-purpose trawler satellites that execute rendezvous proximity and operations, or RPO, missions around other target satellites for undetermined purposes. In some cases, they've actually grappled with satellites and moved them into different orbits. China has directed energy weapons that can be used in all three operational modes, as well as ground to space. And they have anti-satellite killer missiles, as well as space-to-ground missiles for destroying terrestrial targets. And the chart shows what a trawler satellite might look like next to a regular satellite. Interestingly enough, China has also launched on several occasions its version of a space plane that's similar to the US Air Force's X-37B. China is very secretive about what they're calling the Shenlong's mission itineraries, but like the X-37B, the missions are usually multi-year in length, and they orbit at various altitudes and azimuths. So now if we consider the United States counter-space priorities, freedom of action in space is fundamental to all joint military operations, as outlined in the National Security Strategy, the National Defense Strategy, the National Military Strategy. Without freedom to operate in space, the United States cannot operate effectively in any of the warfighting domains. According to General Whiting, the commander of the United States Space Command, the organization is largely focused on four main lines of efforts: posturing and preparing to prevail, understanding and offsetting threats, expanding and strengthening key relationships, and expanding a competitive warfighter advantage. Going forward, commercial space providers like SpaceX are going to be a vital part of the U.S. counter-space priority. Commercial space providers are already acting as force multipliers during both peace and wartime operations, supplementing the assets of the Space Force, which needs to leverage the commercial sector's innovative capabilities, their scalable production, their rapid technology refresh rates, to enhance the resilience of national security space architectures, strengthen deterrence, and support combat commanders' objectives in time of peace, competition, crisis, conflict, and post-conflict. The Commission to Assess United States National Security Space Management Organization voiced significant concern about foreign competitors in early 2001. Their report warned that growing trends, including threats posed by China to U.S. space assets, required new policies in the development of space capabilities to defend U.S. assets in orbit. The issue has now taken on a sense of urgency in Washington, and the elites there, especially the Pentagon, are becoming more fully aware of the technological, the organizational, and the operational advances that China has made towards achieving their strategic objectives. China's strategic and technical evolution includes an expanded presence in space in both passive and active modes. And currently, the U.S. space architecture is tailored to maximize the benefits of space as a peaceful domain. And it leaves it virtually defenseless and vulnerable to current Chinese attacks. Washington appears to have settled the debate about China's motivation and intent, but this has put the military space establishment on its heels. The US is now playing catch up and the meter is running while systemic limitations are burdening the Space Force, its contractors, and its acquisition support infrastructure. In 2015, a DoD white paper, a new space mission assurance taxonomy was rolled out, and this taxonomy is a good place to start when planning new space system acquisitions for satellite networks, system support architectures, and communication links. Finally, we get to the idea of our US space policy, what it is when it comes to US space control. A key question is whether or not any nation can actually hope to control space. And Major Richard Stapp, in a paper written for the Air Command and Staff College, tackled the question straight up. While the requirements to achieve space control are numerous, three stand out as especially critical: sound doctrine, viable technology, and political will. Sound doctrine is what warriors believe in and act on. This doctrine dictates how forces are deployed and how the war is to be engaged. A solid space doctrine, not unlike its air medium counterpart, is required to effectively use the great potential of space in a warfighting mode. Without it, the chances of success are problematic at best. Viable technology is crucial to any concept or doctrine of space control. And suffice it to say that the current technological state of the art lends itself in this way, in ways that were not possible 20 years ago, making it conceivable to create a framework for actually achieving space dominance. Technology is the linchpin which allows space operations to be achievable and effective. Without a solid technological and industrial base that is sustainable and replenishable, no space control doctrine will suffice, no space control strategy will be executable, and no space control policy will be effective. Lastly, the political will is paramount to successfully implement a policy of space dominance and control. Any perceived fecklessness, hesitation, or resistance on the part of policymakers will simply invite invasive and probing reactions and responses from adversaries. To successfully execute a legitimate space policy, the U.S. will need resilient space architectures, space domain awareness, and active and passive on-orbit system element defenses. In closing, the study concluded that China under Xi Jinping is in fact evolving from a status quo to a revisionist power while supporting counterspace as part of an overall unrestricted warfare strategy designed to elevate China to superpower status by 2049 or sooner. And that's all I have, and I appreciate your attention, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. James Roney, for your insightful presentation, and it was very informative.
Thank you.
Military space operations are increasingly influenced by China and Russia's growing capabilities. Both nations are advancing in anti-satellite technologies, space-based intelligence, and strategic use of space for military purposes. This raises concerns about the potential for space conflict and the need for enhanced U.S. space defense strategies, right?
Yes, that is correct. In fact, the United States has spent trillions of dollars over the last 40 years building rather large independent, especially their IR systems. The NRO is notorious for building really large billion-dollar satellites. The problem is they sit up there, they do their job magnificently, but they're extremely vulnerable to space-based weapons. And the ones that I'm concerned about, the ones that are ground launched, the ASATs, they create so much orbital debris that a lot of countries, including China, now are kind of moving away from them. And it's much better to have directed energy weapons, high-powered microwaves. And the one that's really a little bit nerve-wracking are these trawler satellites. They're rather small satellites that can literally do a rendezvous proximity and operations maneuver around one of our larger satellites. And quite simply, with a can of black spray paint, could literally spray paint the sensors on the satellite and destroy a billion-dollar satellite. Or they could grapple onto it and actually move it out of its orbit so that it can't perform its mission. So right now, the U.S. space architecture is very vulnerable. Now, I know the Space Force is looking at a lot of different architectural concepts, including what they call proliferated space mesh architectures involving hundreds, if not thousands of satellites, not unlike Elon Musk's Starlink program. And by doing that, they can spread all the satellites around in such a way that the network itself responds like a single large satellite, but it has the benefits of a mesh network. Whereas if China does, in fact, take out a couple of the smaller satellites, these satellites are almost like pixels in a picture, and you can afford to lose a few pixels without losing the big picture. So it's a good idea to start thinking about larger networks and start. I think in the short term, though, we also need to provide some kind of defenses for the larger systems, the legacy systems that currently exist, until they're phased out at some point. But that may take 15 or 20 years. I hope I answered the question.
Thank you, Dr. Ronnie. We have on the chat box, Bert Chapin says that, do you think Congress is providing the proper financial support and oversight to U.S. military space policy in ongoing defense authorization acts? If not, what should Congress be doing to direct DOD?
So the short answer is I don't think that they've ever supplied Space Force or Space Forces with the dollars they need. I remember when I was in the Air Force, Space Command got its dollars from the Air Force. And so they ended up, once the Air Force fixed all its airplane problems and other things, it got around to peeling off some dollars for Space Command. Now Space Command has its own funding line, and that's a good thing, but it's not funded at levels that they need to do some of the things that I already spoke about, like building mesh networks and providing defenses for some of our legacy systems. So hopefully over the next couple of years, as China continues to evolve its counter space weapons systems, Congress will begin to understand the nature of the threat and provide the kind of funding that's necessary to counter the threat. But I think, like a lot of things, it's probably going to require some kind of an issue in space. We're going to lose a satellite. Something's going to happen. One of these trawler satellites is going to run into one of our satellites and create a problem. And that's when Congress is probably going to react. They're usually pretty slow to react until something happens.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I think you're correct, Jim. One of the problems we have is that we are very reactive. We are not proactive. And it usually takes a major incident to get the United States to really do what it needs to do. And also, I think looking ahead, this is going to take a great deal of presidential leadership to be proactive, to recognize this threat for what it is, and to get the Congress moving. But absent a major catastrophe, which is coming, I don't have a lot of faith that that's actually going to happen.
Couldn't agree with you.
Thank you. Thank you. We have another question from Philip. He is asking, what about the nuclear dimension? Wouldn't the US consider a nuclear response if many of its SATs were hit with directed energy weapons?
So under the 1967 Space Treaty, nuclear weapons in space are forbidden. Unfortunately, other types of conventional weapons are not forbidden, including directed energy. The problem with the nuclear weapon is that it's going to create a huge mess in space, not unlike the ASATs did when China blew up its satellite. And so it's not very feasible that Russia or anybody else is going to use a nuclear weapon in space. They would end up damaging their own satellites and everybody else's just as well as the US satellites. It's much more likely, though, that they'll develop directed energy weapons, which can be targeted towards specific satellites. And they can direct. An interesting thing about directed energy is that you can use it at low levels and simply interfere with a satellite or turn it off for a couple of minutes or a couple of hours, but the satellite is recoverable in terms of its ability to reconstitute itself. That creates a deterrence in one respect. It also creates a problem for the United States. Is the United States going to go to war over a satellite or a couple of satellites being turned on and off by an enemy? In fact, right now, over the war zone at Ukraine, some of our American GPS satellites are being tagged, and we're losing some of the coverage over Ukraine, and that was intentional on the part of the Russians. So, as Kim already pointed out in her paper, space warfare in many respects is already occurring.
Thank you, Dr. Ronnie.
I do not
Dr.
think
Fisher?
the U.S. would consider a nuclear response to that. It's my short answer.
Right.
Thank you. We have another question from Richard. He's asking, any other allies realizes the threat and does anything about it?
Well, we have alliances, like we have military alliances around the world, especially with Europe and Australia, Japan. But they're not as actively engaged in some of these issues as the United States as well. Obviously, we still have the most advanced space program in the world, but we do have alliances. With the Italians and the French, the British, the Germans, they help us. They supply sensor platforms and buses and other things that aid our space program. They're fully aware of what we're doing in space. They're also fully aware of the threats posed by China and Russia in terms of counter space. And so I think you will see some motivated Europeans coming to Washington to talk about this issue. And perhaps, as Kim was alluding to, maybe we can get Washington a little more motivated if the Europeans put a little more pressure on our own Congress.
Thank you, everyone, for attending the session. And thank you again to our presenters, Dr. Kim Official and Dr. James Rooney. We wish you both the very best.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much. Thank you,
Thank you,
everybody, for
everyone.
attending.
Thanks.